The prison was supposed to be the safest place a man like Victor Miles could ever walk into. For 12 years, he had reported to duty at Stonebrook Correctional Facility, a mid-sized women's prison tucked on the edge of a small southern town, where cornfields stretched just beyond the razor wire. He wore the khaki uniform, carried the ring of jangling keys, and acted as if nothing inside those walls could touch him. To neighbors on his quiet cul-de-sac, he was the steady man with the neat lawn, a wife, and 2 children. But behind the concrete walls of Stonebrook, Victor was something else entirely, a man who blurred the lines between authority and intimacy until the lines no longer existed at all. It was just after dawn when another guard, doing routine rounds, stumbled across a sight no one could ever have imagined. Victor's lifeless body, slumped against the wall of an empty cell. His face was darkened from strangulation, a strip of prison-issued sheet twisted tightly around his neck. There were no signs of forced entry, no camera footage to explain why he had been inside that cell. The guard dropped his flashlight and staggered back, his shouts echoing down the concrete hall. Within minutes, alarms blared, metal doors slammed, and a place used to chaos became frozen in shock. The news spread like wildfire through the prison yard. Some inmates laughed, whispering, "He finally got what was coming." Others looked uneasy, remembering their own tangled history with him. By lunchtime, it was on every television in the state. Veteran prison guard found dead under mysterious circumstances. But the most sensational headline hadn't even broken yet. Reporters were still piecing it together. The secret Victor had carried for months, the scandal already boiling beneath the surface. For women behind bars were pregnant at the same time. For women, all pointing to the same man as the father. To outsiders, it sounded like a tabloid fantasy, a lurid story cooked up to sell newspapers. But for those inside Stonebrook, it had been building for a long time. Everyone had heard the whispers about Victor, how he lingered too long at certain cells, how he smuggled in extra snacks or phone privileges, how he promised protection to those who gave him what he wanted. In an environment where loneliness was currency and power meant survival, Victor had turned himself into both the dealer and the debt collector. His colleagues noticed the tension, too. Some joked crudely about Miles' harem, but others warned he was crossing a line that could bring the whole place down. Even the warden, a stern woman named Clarice Donnelly, had pulled him into her office weeks earlier after rumors began to swirl. "Keep your nose clean, Miles," she had warned. "This place eats men alive who think they're smarter than the system." He had nodded, smiled his easy smile, and walked back into the cell blocks like nothing could touch him. But the truth was already unraveling. Each woman carried a piece of him now, and with each passing week their swelling bellies became evidence too large to hide. The state's Department of Corrections had quietly opened an investigation, and DNA testing would soon confirm the impossible: one man for pregnancies. The scandal threatened lawsuits, firings, and criminal charges. For Victor, it meant his career, his marriage, and his carefully built facade were all collapsing at once. And then, before investigators could get their answers, he was found dead. Was it a guilty conscience that drove him into that cell? A suicide staged with a torn sheet? Or had the women, or perhaps even his fellow officers, decided justice would come quicker at the end of a noose fashioned inside the very walls he once controlled? The story of Victor Miles was no longer about a guard who broke the rules. It was about a man whose double life had caught up with him, whose secrets multiplied until they became flesh and blood, and whose final breath was stolen in the one place he thought he ruled. For the families of the unborn children, for the prisoners who lived under his watch, and for the colleagues who once shared shifts with him, the question that echoed louder than any prison siren was simple: who really killed Victor Miles, and why? Life inside Stonebrook Correctional Facility was a world of its own, sealed off from the town that slept peacefully just a few miles down the road. For the women who lived there, every day followed the same rhythm: roll call at dawn, meals on plastic trays, the hum of fluorescent lights in narrow hallways, the constant rattle of keys. To the public, prison was punishment. To the women trapped inside, it was monotony broken only by the rare moments of connection: letters from home, visits on Sundays, or fleeting conversations in the yard where they clung to slivers of normal life. But behind the bland gray walls, there were unspoken rules and invisible hierarchies, and everyone knew that guards held the power to tilt the scales. Victor Miles thrived in that imbalance. On paper, he was just another officer pulling long shifts for steady pay. But among the inmates, he was known for what he could make happen. A bag of chips when commissary was cut off, a phone call after hours, an extra blanket during winter. Small gestures that didn't show up in any report, but meant everything in a place where deprivation was the rule. To the women, Victor was a lifeline and a temptation rolled into one. Some despised him, calling him a predator. Others whispered about him like he was a forbidden secret they couldn't resist. For women stood out in particular. They had nothing in common except the fact that Victor had woven himself into each of their lives. Tasha Green, 29, was the tough one. She came from the streets of Atlanta, a drug dealer who wore her scars like armor. She told anyone who would listen that she didn't need a man for anything, but Victor knew how to find the cracks in her pride. He called her boss lady, smuggled her flavored coffee packets when she complained about the bitter prison brew. One night in the laundry room, their banter turned into something else, something physical, and afterward she swore it would never happen again. It did. Then there was Imani Brooks, only 24, locked up for shoplifting that spiraled into probation violations. Unlike Tasha, Imani was vulnerable, a girl who looked younger than her years. She'd grown up with absent parents, and in Victor she saw the father figure she never had, until the lines blurred and she confused his attention for love. When she began showing signs of pregnancy, she clutched her belly like it was the first good thing she'd ever owned. Cheryl Daniels, 33, was different. Convicted of killing her abusive husband, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that even other inmates respected. Victor gravitated toward her not with jokes, but with sympathy. He told her he understood that no woman should have to suffer the way she did. She believed him. In her journal, later seized by investigators, she wrote about him as if he was a rescuer, the one man who finally treated her with tenderness. And then there was LaToya Price. At 27, she was sharp, calculating, locked up for credit card fraud, but always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. She was the one who knew the rules, knew how to play the system, and knew how to play Victor. Some inmates whispered she had dirt on him, that she used her hold over him to score contraband, favors, and protection. LaToya didn't gush about him the way the others did. She smiled like she knew she was in control, like she was writing the script he thought he was directing. Within the cell blocks, tensions rose as words spread about Victor's relationships. Prison was a breeding ground for jealousy, and when 4 women shared one secret man, sparks were bound to fly. Arguments broke out in the yard. Whispered insults turned into shoving matches. Tasha accused LaToya of manipulating him. Imani cried when Cheryl stopped speaking to her. Guards tried to keep order, but everyone knew the fights weren't about food or TV privileges. They were about Victor. Among the staff, he became a joke and a warning. Some guards rolled their eyes, saying, "Let Miles dig his own grave." Others worried the scandal would blow back on them all. Stonebrook already struggled with lawsuits, and if word got out that one of their own had impregnated multiple inmates, it would destroy what little reputation the facility had left. Still, Victor brushed it off. He told his closest co-worker, "They need me more than I need them. They won't talk." But people were already talking. The women weren't just carrying babies, they were carrying evidence. Rumors turned into formal complaints, and soon the Department of Corrections was forced to launch an investigation. Victor acted calm, but the cracks were showing. He had late-night arguments on the phone with his wife. He avoided eye contact with supervisors. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he stared too long at the yard, as if calculating how quickly everything he'd built could collapse. Inside those walls, the power had shifted. The man who once controlled the cell doors and privileges had become trapped in a web of his own making. And though the town outside still saw him as a husband, a father, and a guard in uniform, the women of Stonebrook knew the truth. Victor Miles belonged to them now, body, blood, and secret. It started with whispers, the kind that floated down the concrete corridors and slipped under steel doors. Someone said Tasha had been throwing up every morning, clutching her stomach like she'd swallowed razor blades. Another swore Imani fainted in the yard during lineup. Within weeks, the rumors hardened into something impossible to deny. Multiple women in Stonebrook were pregnant, and the timing was too close to be coincidence. At first, the prison administration tried to smother the talk. Female inmates sometimes arrived already pregnant, or so the official story went. But when 4 women, Tasha, Imani, Cheryl, and Latoya, each confirmed to medical staff that they were expecting, suspicion turned into scandal. The facility doctor, a worn-out man used to dealing with minor illnesses, found himself filling out prenatal charts one after another. When asked who the fathers were, the women refused to speak, but their silence was louder than any confession. They exchanged glances in the waiting room, an unspoken acknowledgement that their secret had become too big to contain. The prison buzzed like a hive. Inmates crowded around cafeteria tables, lowering their voices as they speculated about who could have slipped through the cracks of Stonebrook's rigid walls. The answer seemed both obvious and unbelievable. Some said he had been careless. Others insisted he thought himself untouchable. Now, for lives growing inside, 4 women carried the proof no one could ignore. For the administration, panic set in. An internal memo circulated. Any staff caught fraternizing with inmates would be immediately suspended. But it was already too late. Investigators from a Department of Corrections arrived, armed with questions and swabs for DNA testing. Victor tried to laugh it off at first, saying the women were lying, conspiring against him to score better treatment. But the science had no sense of humor. By the time the results came back, the story was sealed. All 4 pregnancies pointed to one father, and it was him. The revelation hit the outside world like a thunderclap. Local news stations ran lurid headlines, baby scandal behind bars, and national outlets picked up the story within days. Commentators called it one of the worst breaches of ethics in state prison history. Activists demanded accountability, insisting the women were victims of abuse under color of authority. Victor's neighbors couldn't believe it. The man who waved politely from his front yard was now splashed across television screens as the baby maker guard. His wife stopped showing her face in town. Parents pulled their children away from his kids at school as though scandal were contagious. Inside Stonebrook, the pregnancies became a source of tension and danger. Tasha walked with a hand on her stomach like she was protecting her claim, glaring at anyone who so much as whispered Victor's name. Imani, still fragile, began to dream out loud about a family, telling anyone who would listen that maybe this was her chance at a new beginning. Cheryl grew quieter, writing long journal entries that guards later said read more like love letters than diary pages. And Latoya, ever calculating, used her condition like a weapon, hinting she knew things that could ruin not just Victor, but others too. The other inmates weren't sympathetic. Some mocked the pregnant women, calling them traitors for cozying up to a guard. Others envied them, saying they'd traded flesh for protection and won. Fistfights broke out in the showers, jealousies boiling over into violence. Guards had to separate entire cell blocks. What had once been whispers was now a full-blown civil war inside the prison, and Victor was at the center of it all. For Victor himself, the walls closed in tighter every day. He arrived to work with bags under his eyes, snapped at colleagues, and avoided the women whenever he could. But avoiding them only made the situation worse. The pregnancies were living, breathing evidence of his betrayal, of his vows, of his badge, of the rules he thought he could bend without consequence. He started to hear threats whispered through the bars. "Your time is coming, Miles." He found notes slipped under his locker, crude drawings of nooses. Even some of his fellow officers began to distance themselves, muttering that he had put a target on all their backs. By the time the story reached the front pages of the state's largest newspaper, Victor's life was already unraveling. His marriage was crumbling, his career dangling by a thread, and his once unquestioned authority inside Stonebrook was gone. What remained was a man surrounded by 4 unborn children, each one carrying his DNA, and each one marking him as guilty in the eyes of both the law and the court of public opinion. And then came the darkest question of all. In a place where grudges never die and power shifts in the shadows, how long could a man like Victor Miles survive? By the time autumn settled over Stonebrook, the scandal had grown too large to contain. The pregnancies were no longer rumors. They were undeniable facts that walked through the halls in swollen bellies and hushed doctor visits. What started as whispers had hardened into open hostility. The prison, once controlled by rigid rules and daily routines, began to feel like a pressure cooker on the verge of explosion. Inside the women's blocks, tension ran high. Tasha became fiercely territorial, strutting through the yard with her chin lifted, daring anyone to question her claim. "I was first," she snapped at Cheryl one morning after catching her sitting with Victor during meal duty. Cheryl, who had once carried herself with quiet dignity, fired back with an edge nobody had seen before. First doesn't mean anything when he was in everyone's bed. The exchange ended in shoving, guards pulling them apart while other inmates cheered from the sidelines like spectators at a fight. Imani, caught between the stronger personalities, withdrew. She cried more often, clutched her stomach like the baby inside was the only safe thing left in her world. Inmates mocked her fragility, calling her daddy's little girl, and one guard overheard her whispering in the chapel, begging God not to let her baby grow up cursed. Latoya, meanwhile, thrived in the chaos. She didn't need to fight or beg. She wielded information like a blade. She hinted to the others that she had leverage on Victor, that she knew details that could ruin him far worse than a scandal in the press. When investigators circled closer, she smirked like she had already written the ending. Some inmates whispered that Latoya was the puppet master, that she wanted Victor for herself, or that she was setting him up for a fall no one would see coming. Among the staff, patience snapped. Guards who had once joked about Victor's harem now treated him like a contagion. One officer refused to share a shift with him, muttering that he wasn't going to lose his pension because of Miles' mess. Another told him flat out, "You're not one of us anymore. You're one of them." In a world where brotherhood was survival, Victor had become an outsider in his own uniform. The warden, under mounting pressure from the state, suspended him pending investigation. But suspending him didn't take him out of Stonebrook. For reasons no one understood, or at least no one admitted, Victor kept showing up, still moving through the corridors like he had the right to be there. Some said he was trying to collect favors, smooth things over. Others swore they saw him slipping notes to the women, desperate to keep their loyalty. His very presence ignited anger on both sides of the bars. Threats began surfacing in ways too bold to ignore. One morning, Victor found the word rat scrawled in black marker across his locker. A week later, someone left a crude drawing of a hangman on his windshield in the staff lot. At home, his wife had already left with the kids, unable to withstand the shame of reporters parked on their street. He started sleeping in a rented room above a bar, showing up to work unshaven, eyes red. To anyone watching, it looked like a man unraveling. But Victor wasn't just afraid of the inmates. He was afraid of his fellow officers. He confided to one colleague he still trusted, "They think I embarrassed the uniform. Someone's going to make me pay." When asked who, he only shook his head and muttered, "Could be anyone now." Inside Stonebrook, the women circled each other like predators and prey. Each pregnancy was a live reminder of betrayal and jealousy. Latoya cornered Imani in the showers, whispering that she should keep quiet if she wanted to survive. Tasha threw a tray at Cheryl in the cafeteria, shouting that Victor had promised her he'd leave his wife. Guards wrote incident reports until their pens ran dry, but the paper trail couldn't capture the atmosphere of barely contained violence. Then came the anonymous letters, slipped under the warden's office door, mailed to the Department of Corrections, even taped to the glass of a guard shack. "He won't make it out alive. You can't protect him forever. 4 women, 1 secret, blood will pay." The handwriting varied, but the threat was always the same. Victor began looking over his shoulder constantly. He told anyone who would listen that he was being followed, that he heard whispers in the halls when he turned corners. Some staff dismissed it as paranoia, but others believed it. They'd seen too many men who thought they were untouchable suddenly find themselves at the wrong end of prison justice. By November, Stonebrook was no longer a prison. It was a ticking bomb. The pregnant women fought for dominance. The inmates chose sides. The guards turned on one another, and Victor stood at the center like a man surrounded by sharks in bloodied water. He had always believed he could control the system, that his charm and authority would keep him safe. But now, with every passing day, it became clearer. The system was about to eat him alive. The night Victor Miles died began like any other shift change at Stonebrook. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The clang of metal doors echoed through the halls, and the low murmur of voices carried from the cell blocks. Nothing about the evening suggested that within a few hours, one of their own would be found lifeless inside the very walls he once ruled. Around 10 p.m., Victor was seen leaving the staff lounge. Cameras caught him walking down the corridor towards C Block, where most of the inmates had already been locked in for the night. He carried no paperwork, no flashlight, no reason anyone could point to for being there. A fellow guard passing by remembered him looking tense, distracted, like a man walking into a storm. "You good, Miles?" the guard asked. Victor nodded, but didn't speak. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. At 5:17 the next morning, Officer Hernandez made her usual rounds. She reached an unused cell at the far end of C Block and noticed something strange. The heavy steel door was closed, though it was supposed to stay propped open. When she swung it wide, her flashlight beam froze on a sight that made her stumble back. Victor was slumped against the wall, his legs sprawled, his uniform wrinkled. Around his neck, a strip of torn bedsheet dug deep into the flesh, tied clumsily to the bars above. His face was swollen, tinged a terrible shade of blue, his eyes half open as if still watching. The alarm was pulled. Officers swarmed the block, radios crackling, keys jangling in a chaos that cut through the early morning silence. Paramedics rushed in, but quickly declared what everyone already knew. He was gone. Within minutes, news of his death shot through the prison like lightning. Inmates pressed their faces to the bars, some gasping, others laughing openly. One voice shouted, "Guess Daddy ain't coming back." The guards shouted for silence, but the jeers kept rolling through the block, echoing off concrete like a taunt from the dead. At first glance, it looked like suicide. A man under investigation, disgraced by scandal, humiliated in the eyes of his peers. Why wouldn't he hang himself? But Detective Carla Hughes, called in from the county sheriff's office, wasn't convinced. The scene didn't fit. The sheet was tied too low to create enough pressure for self-suspension. When investigators canvassed the prison, stories clashed. One inmate swore she heard footsteps in the corridor around midnight, heavier than a woman's stride. Another claimed she saw LaToya lingering near the block long after lights out. Tasha, when questioned, crossed her arms and sneered. Maybe he finally did the right thing for once. Cheryl wept and insisted Victor would never kill himself, while Imani said nothing at all, staring at her lap like silence was the only safe answer. Even among the guards, whispers spread. Some suspected the women. Others muttered about one of their own, suggesting that a fellow officer might have helped cover it up. Victor had embarrassed them all, dragged the department's reputation through the mud. "He put a target on our backs," one guard told Carla off the record. Somebody decided to take it off. Outside the prison, the media circus went into overdrive. Headlines screamed guard an inmate baby scandal found dead in jail cell. Protesters gathered at the gates, some demanding justice for the women, others shouting that Victor's death was proof of a cover-up. Talk shows debated whether he was a predator who got what he deserved or a man trapped in a situation too big for him to escape. His family, already shattered, watched in horror as his name was dragged through the mud one more time, now linked forever with both scandal and mystery. At Victor's funeral, his wife didn't bother to hide her anger. She stood stiff by the coffin, whispering to a relative, "He lied to all of us. Even in death, he lied." Few colleagues showed up, and those who did kept their eyes low. The town that once saw him as a steady neighbor now saw him as a headline. and no one wanted to be caught in the reflection of his disgrace. Back at Stonebrook, the cell where he died remained sealed, but the stain lingered in every corner. Guards avoided walking past it. Inmates whispered that his ghost haunted the block, that if you listened closely during night rounds, you could hear keys jangling with no one there. To them, Victor Miles had never really left. His secrets were buried inside those walls, and someone was making sure they stayed that way. The official report would later call it death by asphyxiation, with the manner undetermined. But inside Stonebrook, no one called it undetermined. Some call it payback. Some called it justice. Others called it unfinished business. And the truth, who wrapped that sheet around Victor's neck, who helped him into that cell, who decided his time was up, was a truth that seemed determined to rot inside the prison, just like the man who once thought he ruled it. Detective Carla Hughes had walked into plenty of crime scenes during her 20 years in law enforcement, but something about the way Victor Miles was found gnawed at her. She stood in that empty cell long after the paramedics rolled his body away, her gloved fingers tracing the rough tear of the sheet still knotted around the bars. It was staged. She felt it in her bones. Miles hadn't come here to end his life. Someone had brought him here, and someone had made sure he wouldn't walk out. The first step was the autopsy. Dr. Elaine Shunn, the county medical examiner, laid out her findings under the sterile light of the morgue. The sheet had left ligature marks, yes, but the depth and angle didn't match a typical hanging. Victor's neck showed bruising from different directions, as if multiple hands had applied pressure. There were abrasions on his forearms, consistent with defensive wounds. Most telling of all, tiny skin fragments under his fingernails belonged to someone else. He fought back, Dr. Chin concluded. This was no suicide. Carla nodded grimly. That single detail confirmed what she already believed. The challenge was figuring out who, in a prison filled with enemies, had the access and the motive. She started with the inmates. Each of the 4 women tied to Victor had reason to resent him. Tasha Green was combative from start. She leaned back in the interview chair, arms crossed, daring Carla to prove anything. That man thought he owned me, she spat. Owned all of us. Maybe somebody decided to show him he wasn't untouchable. Wasn't me, though. I don't need him bad enough to kill him. Her defiance rang true, but it didn't clear her. Imani Brooks was different. Fragile, trembling, she twisted a tissue in her hands until it shredded. He told me he loved me, she whispered. Said he'd take care of me when I got out. But then he said the same thing to them. Her voice cracked, but when Carla pressed harder, asking where she was the night Victor died, Imani stared at the floor. I was asleep, she murmured. No one could confirm it. Cheryl Daniels cried through her interview, describing Victor as a good man who just made mistakes. She claimed he confided in her, that he was terrified of losing his family, terrified of prison politics closing in on him. He said he was scared somebody was going to hurt him, she admitted. But when Carla asked if Cheryl knew who, Cheryl only shook her head and buried her face in her hands. LaToya Price, however, met the detective's questions with a cool smile. Funny, isn't it? A man who thought he had all the control ends up dead in a cage. Poetic, really. She refused to answer whether she had seen him that night, refused to comment on the strand of braided hair found in his watch strap. You think that proves something? Hair floats, detective. Maybe you dropped it yourself. Her arrogance was infuriating, but it only convinced Carla further that LaToya was at the center of this storm. The investigation turned toward the staff. Carla interviewed Victor's colleagues, and what she heard painted a picture of a man already marked for downfall. Officers admitted resenting him for dragging the department into scandal. One confessed, off the record, that there was talk in the break room about handling it inside before the state could ruin them all. No one admitted involvement, but the hostility was undeniable. Then came the diary. Hidden in a locked drawer of Victor's locker, it was less a diary and more a series of paranoid ramblings. He scribbled about feeling followed in the halls, about threats whispered through cell doors, about eyes that don't blink in the dark. One chilling entry read, "They're closing in. I can't trust anyone, not even my own." The final page, dated 2 nights before his death, ended abruptly. "If I die here, it won't be by my hand." Carla now had evidence pointing in every direction: angry inmates, furious staff, even the possibility of a conspiracy that involved both. But the forensics kept circling back to the women. DNA analysis revealed that the skin under Victor's nails matched LaToya Price. Combined with the hair on his watch strap, it painted a damning picture. Still, Carla hesitated. If LaToya killed him, had she acted alone? Could a woman barely over 5 feet tall subdue a guard twice her size without help? One night, exhausted from combing reports, Carla sat staring at surveillance logs. Most cameras in C Block had blind spots, but one caught a blurry silhouette slipping down the hall near the time Victor disappeared. The figure was slim, hair tied back. Carla froze the frame and zoomed in. It wasn't Victor. It wasn't another guard. It looked like LaToya. She brought the evidence to the district attorney, Carla Nguyen, who listened carefully. "We can make a case," Nguyen said, "but you'll need more than shadows and hair strands. We need motive solid enough to convince a jury." The motive, Carla realized, wasn't just jealousy or revenge. It was survival. LaToya had the most to lose if Victor talked. If he admitted everything to investigators, she could face charges not just for illicit contact, but for extortion. She had leveraged their relationship for contraband and favors. Killing him silenced the one man who could expose her. Carla returned to Stonebrook for one last interview. Sitting across from LaToya, she laid the evidence on the table: the hair, the DNA, the blurry footage. LaToya only leaned forward, her smile sharp. "So what if I touched him? He touched me first. Maybe he deserved worse than what he got." For a moment, her mask slipped, and Carla saw the flicker of pride in her eyes. It wasn't the full truth. Carla still believed others knew, maybe even helped. But in a place where silence was survival, no one else was talking. The state decided it was enough. LaToya was charged with second-degree murder. Still, as Carla filed her final report, unease settled heavy in her chest. The case was tied up neatly for the courts, but in Stonebrook, nothing was neat. She knew Victor Miles hadn't been killed by one set of hands alone. Too many people had wanted him gone. Too many had stood to benefit from his silence. And somewhere in those gray, suffocating halls, the real story of who ended his life remained locked away, just another secret the prison would never let escape. The courthouse in downtown Stonebrook had seen its share of cases, but none that drew the kind of attention LaToya Price's trial did. On the first morning of proceedings, news vans lined the street. Cameras flashed as deputies escorted her inside in shackles, and protesters held signs that cut to the heart of the scandal. Justice for the women. No one above the law. Others, fewer but louder, carried placards that read Predator Guard got what he deserved. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every seat in the gallery, their laptops clicking in rhythm with the gavel. Families of the inmates, former colleagues of Victor Miles, and curious locals pressed in to witness the drama. At the prosecution's table sat Assistant District Attorney Carla Nguyen, her posture sharp and commanding. Across from her, LaToya's defense attorney, Samuel Breyer, smoothed his tie and whispered to his client, who leaned back with a calm, unreadable smirk. The prosecution wasted no time painting Victor as a man who abused his authority and LaToya as the inmate who finally snapped. ADA Nguyen's opening statement cut through the air. This case is not about sympathy for the deceased. It is about responsibility. Victor Miles may have failed in his duty as an officer, but he did not deserve to be murdered. The evidence will show that the defendant, LaToya Price, lured him into a cell, attacked him, and silenced him forever. Breyer countered with a different picture. His voice rose with righteous indignation as he addressed the jury. "My client is a victim. She was preyed upon by a man in power, a man who used his uniform as a shield while exploiting the women he was sworn to guard. This so-called investigation is nothing more than a cover-up, scapegoating Ms. Price to protect a corrupt system." He gestured toward LaToya, who lowered her eyes at just the right moment, playing the part of the abused inmate. The trial became a spectacle of contradictions. Witness after witness took the stand. Tasha Green testified first, her voice sharp and steady. "He thought he was untouchable," she told the jury. Walked around here like we were toys. Maybe she did it, maybe she didn't, but he had it coming. The prosecution winced at her bluntness. The defense seized on it, using her words to suggest broader resentment that could point to anyone. Imani Brooks followed, trembling in her seat. She described late-night encounters, whispered promises, and the crushing realization that Victor told the same lies to multiple women. "He broke me," she said softly, tears sliding down her cheeks. The gallery fell silent, the human weight of the scandal pressing in. Nguyen used Imani's pain to frame motive. Betrayal turned to rage. Breyer flipped it, insisting it showed how deeply Victor had manipulated vulnerable women, including LaToya. Cheryl Daniels was perhaps the most sympathetic. She spoke of Victor's kindness, how he once brought her extra blankets during winter, how she believed he cared. "But he was scared," she added. "He told me he thought somebody wanted to kill him." Her words gave weight to the theory of conspiracy, but Nguyen quickly redirected, pressing her to admit that Victor never once accused a guard, only inmates. The physical evidence was the prosecution's strongest weapon. Forensic experts presented DNA results. Skin cells under Victor's fingernails matched LaToya's. A strand of braided hair found in his watch strap matched hers as well. Surveillance footage showed a figure resembling LaToya moving through the corridor near the time of death. "The science doesn't lie," Nguyen told the jury. "This defendant's presence at the crime scene is undeniable." Breyer struck back by attacking the chain of custody. He suggested evidence could have been contaminated, hair could have transferred innocently, and that in a prison full of women with similar hairstyles, certainty was impossible. "You want to believe this is a neat case," he thundered, "but neatness is a luxury in Stonebrick." Tensions boiled when Carla Hughes took the stand. Calm and methodical, she outlined her investigation, her belief that Victor's death was staged, and her conclusion that LaToya orchestrated it. Breyer pounced during cross-examination, demanding why no other suspects were pursued with equal vigor. "You wanted an easy conviction," he sneered, "and my client was the perfect scapegoat." Hughes didn't flinch. "We followed the evidence," she replied, "and it led to her." The trial stretched for weeks, each day peeling back another layer of dysfunction. Journalists dubbed it the Baby Maker Guard trial, and nightly broadcasts replayed testimony with sensational commentary. Social media exploded, hashtags dividing the public. Hashtag Justice for Victor versus hashtag Justice for LaToya. When closing arguments arrived, Nguyen stood tall before the jury. Victor Miles may not have been a saint, but he was still a man, a husband, a father. He did not deserve to be strangled and left like garbage in a prison cell. The defendant's DNA, her presence, her motive, together, they tell the story you cannot ignore. She is guilty of murder. Breyer countered with passion. "Look at the system that bred this tragedy. A corrupt guardhouse, a failing prison, women exploited, silenced, shamed. My client's only crime is surviving in a place designed to destroy her. Don't let them use her as a scapegoat for Victor's sins." The jury deliberated for nearly 2 days. Outside, crowds gathered, chanting, arguing, waiting. When the foreperson finally stood in the hushed courtroom, every eye locked on LaToya. On the charge of second-degree murder, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant guilty." Gasps rippled through the gallery. LaToya blinked once, her smirk gone, her expression hard as stone. Breyer slammed a hand on the table, muttering about appeals. Nguyen exhaled sharply, the weight of victory tempered by unease. Judge Leonard Harlow sentenced LaToya to 25 years, with a possibility of parole after 20. But as deputies led her away, LaToya turned her head and said clearly enough for reporters to catch it, "I didn't do it alone." The room buzzed with shock. For a moment, the gavel's rap could not silence the questions that rose like thunder. If LaToya wasn't alone, who else had been there in that cell? The trial had ended, but the mystery of Victor Miles's death had not. The verdict was supposed to bring closure, but in Stonebrick and the town beyond its gates, the echoes of the trial lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Victor Miles was gone, buried quietly with only a handful of mourners. LaToya Price was sentenced, her smirk replaced by the cold stare of a woman headed back to a cell for decades. Yet the questions that haunted everyone, the questions about who else had been there that night, who else might have helped silence Victor, remained unanswered. For the 4 women left behind with pregnancies, life twisted into something even more complicated. Tasha gave birth first, a baby boy delivered under fluorescent lights and sterile hands. She clutched him tight, tears streaming down her face, before the child was taken away by child services. He went to live with her sister in Atlanta, a new name on a birth certificate that carried no mention of Victor Miles. Tasha swore from that moment forward she'd never forgive the man who had both given her a child and stolen her chance to raise him. Imani's baby girl arrived fragile, only 5 pounds, her tiny cry echoing through the prison infirmary. For weeks afterward, Imani walked through the block hollow-eyed, arms aching from the absence. She wrote letters to the foster family, but never received a reply. To her, Victor's memory was tangled with both love and devastation. "He gave me something to live for," she whispered to a chaplain one day, "but he left me with nothing." Cheryl's child was placed with her elderly mother, a woman already stretched thin raising grandchildren. Still, Cheryl seemed almost relieved. She called the boy her second chance, telling herself that maybe, when her sentence ended, she could return to a family that had been rebuilt instead of broken. But the weight of knowing his father's identity, how to explain it one day, sat heavy on her heart. And LaToya, even behind bars, used her pregnancy like currency. She traded promises of naming rights, custody deals, and family secrets for favors. Her baby, too, was placed with relatives, but LaToya's influence stretched beyond the walls, whispers traveling back to Stonebrick that she had already crafted a future for herself once she got out. For Victor's wife and children, the aftermath was brutal. She divorced him posthumously, changed her children's last names, and sold a house on their cul-de-sac. At the funeral, she had refused to let the kids touch the coffin, as though shielding them from contamination. "He betrayed us," she told reporters later. "He betrayed everyone." The children grew up carrying a name they no longer used, haunted by whispers at school about their father, the guard who fathered babies with inmates, then died in disgrace. The Department of Corrections launched its own inquiry, promising reform. New policies were written, stricter surveillance, more oversight, counseling for staff. But inside the prison, nothing really changed. Guards still wielded power, inmates still bartered favors, and silence was still the currency that bought survival. For the women who had once known Victor, life moved on, but his shadow hung in every corner. Detective Carla Hughes closed her case file with frustration. LaToya had been convicted, but her last words in the courtroom, "I didn't do it alone," stuck in Carla's mind like a thorn. She suspected other guards had helped, or at least turned a blind eye, but no one came forward. The official record would always say undetermined, but Carla knew better. In Stonebrook, justice rarely followed a straight line. In the town, debates raged on. Some insisted Victor got what he deserved, a predator who abused his position and paid the price. Others argued that whatever his sins, murder was never justified. The case became fodder for podcasts, documentaries, and true crime blogs. His story was dissected endlessly. Was he victim or villain? Was LaToya a cold-blooded killer or a woman cornered by circumstance? The line blurred with every retelling. Years later, locals still lowered their voices when passing the old prison. Guards claimed the empty cell where Victor died was cursed. Some swore they heard whispers at night, keys jangling with no one in sight. Inmates told stories of a shadow that lingered at the end of C Block, watching, waiting. Whether ghost or rumor, Victor Miles had never really left. And then there were the children. For babies born of scandal, carrying DNA that tied them to a man who had lived 2 lives and died violently for it. They grew up in different homes, scattered across the state, some knowing the truth of their father, others shielded from it. But one day, inevitably, they would come looking. They would find newspaper clippings, trial transcripts, maybe even each other. And when they did, They would have to face the same question that haunted everyone who ever knew their father. Who was Victor Miles really? A predator, a victim, a father, or just a man crushed by the weight of secrets too heavy to carry? In the end, Stonebrook remembered him not with honor, but with unease. His story was told as a warning, a parable whispered to new officers, "Don't be another Miles." And for the women who carried his children, for the colleagues who carried his shame, and for the town that carried his name into infamy, the truth remained bitter and unsatisfying. There were no winners, only survivors, and 4 lives born out of the wreckage of one man's downfall. In the end, the story of Victor Miles became more than just a headline about a prison guard who crossed the line. It became a cautionary tale whispered in training academies and retold on talk shows, a reminder of how power can corrode, how secrets can fester, and how one man's choices can ripple far beyond the walls he thought he controlled. Stonebrook never really escaped his shadow. The cell where his body was found remains locked, a silent monument to betrayal and unfinished justice. Guards passing on night shift swear they hear keys rattling, as if Victor still makes his rounds. Inmates tell new arrivals the story like a ghost tale, their voices low. Don't trust too much. Don't forget what happened to Miles. For the 4 children born of the scandal, the legacy is more complicated. They carry his name in their DNA, but not in their lives. Scattered in foster homes and relatives' care, they grew up with whispers trailing them. Whispers of a father they'll one day have to reckon with, a man remembered not with pride but with infamy. Whether they embrace or reject that bloodline, their existence ensures the story will never truly fade. And so the question lingers, unanswered but inescapable. Was Victor Miles a predator who got what he deserved, a victim of a system that turned on him, or both? The truth, like the prison itself, remains locked away behind steel doors and silent walls. What everyone agrees on is this: Stonebrook will never forget the guard who fathered 4 babies, and who ended up dead in the very cage he thought he controlled.